Welcome to a hopefully brief yet comprehensive introduction to conflict resolution. I'm going to take you through over the next few slides a series of definitions and examples at different spatial scales of how conflict is resolved globally. This is very much an introduction. I'm going to introduce you to the outline concepts, some well-known case studies, and then at the end I'll set the scene for a bit of follow-up work that I'd like you to complete before we meet for the next lesson. So if we just look at the definition of conflict resolution, very, very straightforward. The means by which conflict at a variety of spatial scales can be brought to an end, and of course we're going to look here both at local right the way up to international scale conflict resolution. And an important point to draw out is this one down the bottom here that I think we have touched on in class already, is that the expressions of conflict, so how conflict is actually manifested across the world in terms of political activity. We saw that in the Scottish drive for independence, debate/discussion, or even complete war, total war, can sometimes lead to the resolution of that conflict. So don't forget that that those expressions can be resolutions as well. We're going to look very briefly first at the local scale, and here I've just put a couple of images to kind of spark some interest or spark some recognition for the types of conflict and how that we're talking about and how they can be resolved. So more often than not, we're going to look particularly in our study of conflict at conflict at a local scale within the UK, and this is more often than not over the use of land as a resource, so building something on land which then upsets or causes disagreement amongst different parties. Now, conflict at the local scale in the UK is largely resolved by reference to planning authorities. So, for example, if you wanted to build an extension onto your house, you will have to go and apply for planning permission to the planning authority, who will take into consideration other people's feelings or viewpoints before they will grant that planning permission. And the same applies to larger state-funded projects such as the one up here, so you may recognise that as being Terminal 5 at Heathrow. And this then linked into these two photos, which relates to the general expansion of Heathrow and the third runway. And proposals have recently been announced for where that third runway might be built, and that will then go to a planning process, hearing different people's views, residents, business views, etc., etc. Now, down in the corner here, we've got HS2. We've spoken about that recently too. That is currently within the planning process, so considerations are being heard from all parties as to the route of it or whether it should actually be given the go-ahead. So the key thing to remember here is that at the local scale in the UK, conflict is normally resolved by reference to planning authorities, and we're going to do a lot of work on that over the coming lessons. Okay, now moving up to conflict on an international scale, I just want to describe firstly the role of the United Nations. Okay, so the United Nations are pivotal in the resolution of conflict at an international scale. United Nations can both prevent conflict and also resolve it. And I'm going to talk firstly about the resolution aspect. So this is really the resolve aspect. And what we talk about here are the typical United Nations blue helmets, okay, known worldwide as the symbol of peace, the white vehicles and the blue helmets. And that is the symbol of UN peacekeeping. These forces are often made up of multinational combat troops who carry out policing actions in conflict zones. So this photo here is showing some Rwandan troops who are carrying out peacekeeping duties in Darfur and South Sudan. Down here we have Indian troops in an armoured personnel carrier carrying out peacekeeping duties in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, these missions, so these UN missions, normally prefixed by UN and then some sort of acronym, have to be passed by the UN Security Council, and they pass a resolution which then permits these forces to be gathered and then given the mandate to go and police that territory. Now, the other aspect of UN peacekeeping is preventative diplomacy or projects. And I've highlighted a couple of departments or subgroups of the UN here. The first one is the Department of Political Affairs. And the second one down here is the UN Development Programme. Now, these agencies tackle the roots of the conflict, not necessarily the acts of violence that are the result of the conflict. So they're trying to tackle the roots of the conflict before conflict actually kicks off. So if we look just very briefly at the UN Development Programme, just searching on their website, came across an example of their work. They've been doing work in Somalia, launching a civilian police project, which they've been running since 1999, spending £15 million per year in order to prevent civilian conflict and prevent conflict from proliferating. The UN Department for Political Affairs also works on conflict prevention, and I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of work on or using the Political Affairs website a bit later on, so more on them later. Thirdly, we've got the role of NATO. So these two photos are relating to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. NATO also carry out peacekeeping duties, sometimes on behalf or normally on behalf of the United Nations. For example, this photo in the top left is showing the NATO force in Kosovo, so the acronym for that was KFOR. KFOR was the force that I was part of when I went to Kosovo in 2008. And the NATO force in Kosovo did have, and is still actually running today, had a number of mandates. So they were to help reconstruction, to help civilian policing, to prevent conflict between the Muslim Albanians and Orthodox Serbs. That has been running since 1994, and as of 2012, December, there are still over 5,000 troops operating under the NATO mandate in Kosovo. And of course, the most famous NATO deployment in a peacekeeping role, believe it or not, is actually ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. And believe it or not, that they have a UN mandate to, amongst other things, try and create conditions for peace in Afghanistan. Obviously, that's been hampered by the insurgency, the actions of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So it's important to remember that NATO as well, operating in conjunction with the UN, is an important agent of. Now, going to shift on to something slightly different. Again, still on international scale here. I want to talk briefly about peace envoys, and these are individuals. These are normally males, it has to be said, but they are individuals who will travel around the world. They are diplomats, and they will try and broker peace. They will be mediators between governments, between representatives, between groups who are in conflict. Kofi Annan, who is the ex-UN Secretary General, Here's Kofi Annan. You probably recognise him from the news or newspapers. He has been involved in Syria over the last couple of years. He was famous for drawing up the 6-point peace plan, which advocated a ceasefire between the warring factions in the Syrian civil war. However, his plan collapsed in May 2012 after the Hula massacres and the Free Syrian Army offensives, which really sparked the most serious phase of that Syrian civil war. Now, the guy on the right-hand side here is Lakhdar Brahimi. He is an Algerian diplomat. He has taken over from Kofi Annan as the UN's special envoy to Syria as of August 2012. Obviously not having much success in his current role. But these are peace envoys, very important aspects of international conflict resolution. Now this might strike you as a bit of an odd one, but Tony Blair, yep, ex-Prime Minister, he, believe it or not, is also a peace envoy amongst his other roles, and he works for a group called the Quartet excuse me, of the Middle East. Now the Quartet of the Middle East is a group of 4 countries, or organisations: the UN, the US, the EU, and Russia. And his role as special envoy for that group, the Quartet, is to mediate in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And again, he's come under lots of criticism for not being particularly effective in this role. Finally then, just to wrap up before I'll let you loose doing your own research, I'd like to conduct the following work before the next lesson. Now, the first task is to go to the UN Department for Political Affairs website, the link's on Schoology, and to watch a really useful 10-minute video which summarises their role in preventative diplomacy. Secondly, again, the link to the UN Peacekeeping Mission website is on Schoology, and what I'd like to do is research a current mission. Okay, there are 15, I think, current missions around the world. I'd like you to pick one, and I'd like you to do a detailed mind map, okay, on what the mission aims are, a little bit about the background to the conflict, so who is actually in conflict and what are they fighting over, and what is the UN's role in the peacekeeping. So what are they doing to broker peace? What are they doing to resolve conflict? And finally, another bit of reading and possibly just a little bit of noting as well. Read up on Kofi Annan's role, which he has now relinquished. Okay, it's Lakhdar Brahimi, who is now the UN Special Envoy to Syria. But I'd like you to just read up on his role creating the six-point peace plan in Syria and the reasons for its collapse. But that should give you a good idea of what an envoy actually does, how he goes about his work.